Hey everybody, welcome to the video screen for the 3-game Saturday slate for this weekend over on Draftkings. And if you find this video helpful in any way possible, please leave a like. And if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out and I really do appreciate it. And while you're at it, you might as well hit that notification bell as well so you don't miss out whenever I post new content. And YouTube tells me around 50% of the people who watch these videos have not yet subscribed. So if you're a frequent visitor to the channel or if you're just new and you like what you see, consider that subscribe button because it really helps the channel grow. And that obviously helps me out as well. And if you want to follow me over on social media, tell me bottom left hand corner of your screen. If you want to help support the channel over on Patreon, always much appreciated. You get access into the entire NFL DFS data sheet, cheat sheet, projections, Discord chat, and also do NBA stuff as well. Just don't post videos over on YouTube. But I think that's it for the plug. So without further ado, let's dive into today's video. And as always, we'll start with the quarterback position. And up top, we have Kyler Murray at $7,500. He's the most expensive quarterback on the slate, but he's coming off an absolute monster game versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Both him and Jalen Hurts were going at it all game long, and it was a really fun one to watch. Both had around 40 Draftkings points. Hurts actually surpassed it by a little bit, and Kyler Murray just fell short at 38 points, but it was a monster game for Murray. He had over 400 yards passing on that game. Also had a rushing touchdown, around 30 yards rushing as well. But the rushing ability offers you each and every single week, so it's always going to give him a nice floor and ceiling combination. Now, this matchup versus the 49ers is definitely a bit tougher. They've been top 10 versus quarterbacks this year. They're allowing the 9th fewest points per game to the quarterback position. They're also 13th DVA versus the pass. But if you go all the way back to week 1 earlier this season, Murray did put up nearly 30 DraftKings points versus this defense. When I get specific, it was around 27. Had nearly 100 yards on the ground and got into the end zone. Also added around 220 yards and a touchdown through the air as well. So even if he doesn't have a huge game through the air, he always offers you that rushing ability as well, which is always going to boost his floor and give him a high ceiling like I mentioned earlier. On the season, close to a rushing touchdown per game, 6 yards per carry, and over 50 yards rushing as well. So if you got the money for Kyler Murray, I think that's the best way to go in cash games, although Tom Brady at a discount, a great matchup versus Detroit, is definitely an enticing option as well. And the Cardinals also play at a pretty fast pace, which also always boosts your opportunity as well. But dropping down to the mid-range option here, we have Tom Brady, and like I just said, it's a great matchup versus the Detroit Lions. They have the highest implied team total on the slate at 31.5 points. They're also 9.5 point favorites as well. And this game features a 53.5 point over-under. And Ronald Jones is not expected to play once again in this one, so it could be another pass-heavy attack for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And their defense is definitely getting worse lately, so that's always going to help if the game stays close or if they're trailing, for Tom Brady just to be able to air it out all game long, even if it's not the greatest passes in the world. But he's got great weapons to get the ball to, and Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, and Antonio Brown. You also have the corpse of Rob Gronkowski out there as well, and a couple of other wide receivers. Fournette's a capable pass-catching running back, even though he's not the best pass-catching running back. That is his role in the offense. But the matchup here versus Detroit, it is absolutely great. They are 30th DVA versus the pass and allowing the 5th most points per game to the quarterback position, over 22 DraftKings points per game, also over 275 passing yards and over 2 passing touchdowns. So Tom Brady at $6,800, you get a $700 discount here off of Kyler Murray. The only problem is he does not run the ball whatsoever, averaging 0.21 rushing yards per game. So he obviously does not have that floor that Kyler Murray has. But the matchup here, I would not be surprised if he gets over 300 yards passing and throws a couple or a few touchdowns here. And they have a team total of 31.5. It's a good matchup on the ground for Leonard Fournette, but I mean, I'd have to assume Tom Brady's probably going to throw at least a couple of touchdowns here. And if he can get around 300 yards, I definitely think he's going to be a pretty darn good option. Then on the flip side of this game, we have Matthew Stafford at $5,600. I know he's beaten up, but he's still out there playing, which you always got to respect. Matthew Stafford is one of the toughest quarterbacks in the league. Now, with them being 9.5 point dogs here, it should once again be a pass-heavy game script for the Detroit Lions. And this Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense, especially in the passing game, has definitely gotten a lot weaker as the season has progressed. So I actually think he's a pretty decent option here, just as a run back, or not really a run back, but if you want to use Matthew Stafford, you can pair him up with someone like Marvin Jones and then run it back with all the Tampa Bay Buccaneers pass catching options. I don't think that's a bad way to go in tournaments, but I don't think Matthew Stafford is the greatest cash game quarterback here, just because I feel like the upside is maybe just a bit limited because that Lions offense, team total of 22. I'd much rather try to get up to a guy like Tom Brady or Kyler Murray on this slate. But just looking at the matchup numbers, that Buccaneers defense definitely has gotten softer. They're 7th DVA versus the pass, but they're 21st versus quarterbacks now, allowing over 21 DraftKings points per game and close to 300 yards passing per game as well. It's much easier to pass on the Buccaneers than it is to run on them. So I don't hate the idea of using Matthew Stafford in tournaments just to save money, be able to spend up for other skill position players. But the thing is, with this slate, we don't have guys that are around $9,000. I'm pretty sure DeAndre Hopkins is the most expensive skill position player. So even then, it's not like you really have to go too cheap a quarterback to be able to fit in studs across the entire skill position. So he's an option. It's just I don't think he's an absolute must. So with that being said, I think we can move on to the running back position. I got 4 options here in Josh Jacobs, Salvon Ahmed, Leonard Fournette, and Jeff Wilson Jr. But we'll start up top with Josh Jacobs at $6,600. I think it's safe to assume that he's back to full health, considering he had nearly 30 total opportunities in that last game versus the Los Angeles Chargers. Had 26 carries, 3 targets, only had 76 yards, but did get into the end zone, which gave him 20 fantasy points, which was good enough on that slate. But I will say Josh Jacobs, he's a volume play, but he's a very unexciting play pretty much every single week. He's just not the kind of guy that's too flashy. He's going to get a ton of carries, and if he gets into the end zone, I guess you'll be decently happy with the output. But if he doesn't get to the end zone, you're probably not going to be too happy because he really has not been that efficient this season. Looking at his numbers, he's at 3.7 yards per carry, which is not a stat I love to use, but still, he's been very inefficient with his touches. He doesn't get too involved in the passing, about 3 targets per game, which is not that bad. It's definitely up from last season, and 10% target share, which again is not terrible. He should get a couple or a few targets in this game. Now the matchup versus Miami, it's a bit easier to run the Dolphins than it is to pass. They got a pretty good secondary. They're also 23rd DVA versus the run, but they're also allowing only the 8th fewest points per game to the running back position. But I think Josh Jacobs, he's a fine volume play on a 3-game slate, so really all you can ask for is volume on those kind of small slates. So I think he's a fine option, but definitely not an absolute must play. But because I feel like the running backs priced below him, like Salvon Ahmed, Fournette, Jeffrey Wilson, I think they can give you similar production at a cheaper cost, and they might be able to get you up to like a guy like Kyler Murray instead of having to play Matthew Stafford or something like that on this slate. But moving down to Salvon Ahmed here at $5,600, he's coming off a great game versus New England Patriots. He had 23 carries in the game, 122 yards, got into the end zone as well. Also had 3 targets, so not a bad day. And if he gets similar production here at $5,600 and a really good matchup versus the Las Vegas Raiders, I think it'd be definitely one of the best options to use at the running back position. Now, as of right now, I've not seen any news on Myles Gaskin yet. I don't know if he's returning or not. If he returns, obviously really can't play Salvon Ahmed because Myles Gaskin should be the RB1 if he returns. If he's out once again, though, Ahmed should get around 20-plus touches in this game. If that's the case, I like him a lot here versus the Las Vegas Raiders. They also have a 25.25 implied team total, and they're 3-point favorites. So this would set up pretty well for Ahmed, and this is a great matchup on the ground versus the Raiders. They are dead last, 32nd DVA versus the run. They're also allowing the 4th most points per game to the running back position, over 100 rushing yards, and well over a rushing touchdown per game as well, and 5.5 catches. So Ahmed, if he's going to be the full-blown starter here and there's no Myles Gaskin, I'd say he's one of the best options to use on this slate at the running back position. Then dropping down $100 to Leonard Fournette, $5,500, similar to Salvon Ahmed with the guy being missing. It's going to thrust him into the starting role, assuming Gaskin's out. But Ronald Jones is not expected to play once again in this game, so Leonard Fournette will once again be the lead back and lead this backfield in touches and snaps. And if you played Fournette last week, you were pretty happy with the end outcome, but it was not a pretty path to those 21 fantasy points. He only had 49 rushing yards, had 14 carries, which was nice, and 5 targets, only 20 opportunities at $4,500. That's really all you can ask for, is that kind of volume from a guy that was that cheap. But he had 2 touchdowns, so we got a bit lucky there, but that's his role. They're going to be inside the 5. Leonard Fournette should get the ball a couple of times, and I think there's a decent chance he gets into the end zone. That was a tough matchup versus the Falcons as well. I know people don't think of the Falcons' defense being pretty good, which they're definitely not. But versus the run this season, they've been pretty tough on running back. So it was an overall decent day for Leonard Fournette. I mean, obviously it wasn't the prettiest production in the world, but it got you there for fantasy purposes, and I could see that happening once again versus Detroit. I don't think Fournette's going to be the guy where he's going to get 20 carries and nearly 200 rushing yards, but if he can get us like 15 to 20 touches in this game versus Detroit, one of the worst teams in the league versus the running back position, he should be able to pay off his price point on this slate. If we're looking at the overall numbers for Detroit, it is pretty darn bad. They're 26 DVA versus the run. They're allowing the most points per game in the running back position, over 32 points per game, over 115 rushing yards, and well over a rushing touchdown as well, and over a half a receiving touchdown per game and nearly 5 catches. So this game sets up pretty well for Leonard Fournette. Also, game flow wise, according to Vegas, they have a 31.5 implied team total, which is the highest on the entire slate. They're 9.5 point favorites and a pretty high over/under. So I think there should be plenty of scoring opportunities here for Leonard Fournette. Might not be the best day yardage wise, but I think there's a decent chance he finds the end zone once again. Then Jeff Wilson here at $5,000. Raheem Mostert is back on the IR, so he should be the main running back in this game. He played on 60% of the snaps last week, and that's with Raheem Mostert playing a decent portion of that game. So he should lead the backfield in touches and snaps, and if he does, at $5,000, I think that makes him a pretty decent play. Should also get few targets as well. Now the overall matchup versus the Cardinals, they are a bit stingy versus running backs, allowing the 10th fewest points per game to the position, and they're also 15th DVA versus the run, but this is mainly just a price and volume play on a 3-game slate, and I think he's definitely in consideration for our lineups on Saturday. And moving on to the wide receiver position, I only have 4 guys listed here. If you have to go with a punt option, you can certainly do that, but I really don't think that's going to be too necessary on the slate because we don't have guys like Derrick Henry, Christian McCaffrey, Nick Chubb, those kind of guys that were jamming on the slate. Also, Devontae Adams. DeAndre Hopkins is the most expensive guy we have, and he's $8,300. I think I said in the quarterback section that he was around $7,500. That was not correct, but even then, it's not like we're paying for a $9,500 guy. So it shouldn't really, you really shouldn't have to go too much in the dumpster diving category on this slate. But DeAndre Hopkins, he checks in as the obvious wide receiver one. Now, the matchup versus San Francisco, again, it's not the worst defense in the world by any means. They're actually pretty decent. They're allowing the 13th fewest points per the wide receiver position. They're also 13th DFS versus the pass. But this is DeAndre Hopkins. He's pretty much unguardable, so I don't care about the matchups for him. He can go off against any single defense. So if you got the money for him, he's definitely the top option. I think he's kind of like a main priority on this, like, because he's just one of the best players in football. So when it's a small slate, yeah, I think you should be able to find enough money to get him in. And the running backs we talked about, they're pretty much all in the 5K range. The most expensive running back on the slate is Josh Jacobs at $6,600. So you should really have no problem fitting in DeAndre Hopkins. And on the season, he's averaging close to 100 receiving yards per game, about double-digit targets at 30% target share, and at 32% market share of the team's air yards. So yeah, Hopkins obviously a great option. And I would try my very best to be able to jam him in. He might be just the first guy I try to plug in, then we'll build around him on this slate. And he's actually coming off his best game of the season last week versus Philly. We're at 34 Draftkings points. And his second best game of the year actually came against the San Francisco defense all the way back in week 1, where he had 32 Draftkings points, had 14 catches for 151 yards on 16 targets. And not saying he's going to have 30 plus points again, but I'd say he's the safest bet on the slate to have the highest amount of points. So yeah, like Hopkins. Then dropping down to Brandon Ayuk on the flip side of this game, $6,700. The rookie is having a fantastic season, and he's not had a bad game in a very long time. Like, just looking at his recent game log, 22, 24, 20, 19, 23, and 20. The guy has been absolutely awesome this year. With no Deebo Samuel, I'd say he's a lock for nearly 10 plus targets in this game. Looking at the targets recently, the past 2 weeks, 13 and 16. Now, the problem is, I know Nick Moulton's not a great quarterback, but it's probably going to get a little bit worse here because CJ Beathard's not going to be the quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers. So he's going to have to deal with some pretty poor quarterback play, but I think the targets should be good enough for him. And the matchup versus the Cardinals, it's definitely not the softest in the world. If you look at the numbers versus wide receivers this season, there's 22nd, so it's a lot better than what they are DVOA-wise, but it's not definitely not the worst pass defense in the world, but they are 22nd versus wide receivers, so I don't think Ayuk's going to get shut down here, but I would say he's a pretty strong option. Definitely the wide receiver 2 behind DeAndre Hopkins on this slate. And if you're stacking up the Cardinals with Kyler Murray and DeAndre Hopkins, probably would make some sense to want to run that back with someone like Brandon Ayuk, who should lead the team in targets for the 49ers. And then some mid-range or cheaper wide receivers here in Antonio Brown and Marvin Jones. Now, we'll start with Antonio Brown here, and I actually think all 3 Tampa Bay wide receivers are viable: Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, and Antonio Brown. I just have AB listed here because he's the cheapest of the 3, and I feel like he can have pretty much the same amount of targets and have similar production, so why not just use the cheaper guy and then spend up for guys like DeAndre Hopkins and Brandon Ayuk that really don't have to share the targets as much as these 3 wide receivers do. But it's a great matchup here versus Detroit. And AB is actually coming off his best game of the season last week versus the Falcons, where he caught that near 50-yard touchdown, had over 20 DraftKings points, and had 7 targets and close to 100 receiving yards, by far his best day of the entire year. Now, the matchup versus Detroit, it's absolutely great. They're 30th DVOA versus the pass, and they're allowing the 5th most points per game to the wide receiver position. So I think all 3 of these guys can definitely eat. They have the highest implied team total in the slate as well. And if the Tampa Bay Buccaneers can keep this game close, we could have an absolute shootout here. And Vegas does have this as the highest over on the slate at 53.5 points, and it's actually only a half a point lower than the Atlanta Falcons and Kansas City game, and it's about 2.5 points lower than the Green Bay and Tennessee game this week. So it's the 3rd highest projected scoring game of the entire week. So I definitely want some pieces of this game. And Antonio Brown, I think you can pay off that price point at $5,300, assuming he gets around 5 to 10 targets and gives you similar production in his last game. Then moving down to Marvin Jones at $4,900. He's coming off a monster game last week versus the Tennessee Titans, where he had over 30 DraftKings points, his best game of the entire year. But the targets have been pretty good for Marvin Jones the past month or so now. Just going back to 4 weeks ago, he had 12, 12, 8, and 12 targets. So he's averaging over double-digit targets the past month. And that's good enough for me below $5,000 in what should be a pretty high-scoring game. And if you're going to stack out the Buccaneers, it probably makes sense to run it back with one of the Detroit Lions options. And I would say Marvin Jones is the #1 option for me. And the Tampa Buccaneers corners, I mean, their secondary has definitely been getting a lot softer as the season progresses, and they're now 24th versus wide receivers, and that was not the case quite some time ago. So they're definitely heading towards the bottom of the league when it comes to wide receivers, despite being 7th versus the pass, allowing over a touchdown per game to the position, and close to 200 receiving yards per game as well. So assuming Marvin Jones gets 10 plus targets in this game, I think he should be a pretty good option. Definitely one of the better point per dollar option wide receivers on this slate. They're also 9.5 point dogs here at home and a 53.5 point over under game. So should be a pretty pass heavy game script for the Detroit Lions once again. Then moving on to the tight end position, we have Darren Waller, Hawkinson, Rob Gronkowski, and Jordan Reed, only if George Kittle happens to not play again in this game, although it sounds like he might be good to go, and if that's the case, probably can't have too much interest in Jordan Reed, but we'll get into that in a little bit. But Darren Waller, had to put him on here because he's one of the best tight ends in football this year. It's kind of Travis Kelce, then probably a couple steps down, then Darren Waller, quite a few steps down, Mark Andrews, and it's everybody else for the most part. But Waller's a pretty consistent option. He gets targets each and every single week, close to 9 targets per game, close to a 30% target share, and a 25% market share of the team's air yards. And overall, having a pretty darn good season. He's definitely capable of having monster games. We saw that a couple of weeks ago versus the Jets, where he had over 40 Draftkings points in that game. And he actually had 33 points last week versus the Chargers on 9 catches, 150 yards, and 12 targets. So even if Derek Carr's not the quarterback in this game, Marcus Mariota still went his way. So I really don't have concerns either way. So yeah, Darren Waller, if you have the money for him, he's obviously a good option, but I don't think he's an absolute must play because I feel like Hawkinson's a pretty good play, and at $4,600 you get a massive discount there. But Waller's definitely the safest play. It's just it comes at a premium. But Hawkinson here at $4,600, he's been a pretty consistent option without Kenny Galladay in the lineup. Although last week it was a very disappointing game for him, where he only had 2.8 fantasy points. But the games before that, he was pretty consistent: 16, 15, nearly 14, 10. And a bust game versus Washington. But for the most part, he's been pretty consistent this season. So the targets, so I would just chalk that up as a down game, really, at 18 yards and a fumble. But I'm assuming he's going to bounce back here. And like I said with Marvin Jones, I assume the Lions are going to be throwing the ball quite a bit in this game. I assume they're going to be trailing, as evident to their 9.5 point dog status in Vegas. And it should be a pretty high scoring game. And that Tampa Bay Buccaneers pass defense has certainly not looked that good recently. So, and they're also 24th versus tight end. So it's a pretty good spot here for TJ Hawkinson to bounce back. And he's definitely a lot cheaper than Darren Waller. Not saying he's as safe as an option as Darren Waller, but I think on a point per dollar basis, I think he could be pretty close to Waller as long as he doesn't go absolutely nuclear with like 30 plus points in this game. Then Gronkowski at $3,600. Like, I don't love playing Gronk. I mean, the guy's obviously not what he used to be, but he should get a handful of targets in this game, and he's definitely going to be a factor in the red zone. And with them having a team total of 31.5 here, and it's a soft matchup versus Detroit, I'd say there's a halfway decent shot we see Gronkowski in the end zone here, but it's not something you can really bank on. But still, Detroit's 30th DVA versus the pass. Now, they're a bit tough versus tight ends, allowing the 7th fewest points per game to position, but about a half a receiving touchdown per game. But I still like Gronk here as a cheap option, but it's kind of touchdown or bust here because if he doesn't get into the end zone, you're probably not going to be too happy with the production. Then Jordan Reed here at $2,900. So if George Kittle happens to be out for this game, it's going to be really hard to pass up Jordan Reed below $3,000 because he's going to get a handful of targets, and he's found the end zone in recent weeks. But even if Kittle is cleared to play, I wonder how much he'll actually play. Like, is it going to be a full allotment of snaps? If it's not, I still think Jordan Reed can have a role in this offense. Even if George Kittle is the main tight end, I still think Jordan Reed could maybe get a couple of targets here and there. And if you need an absolute pump play to be able to fit in a bunch of studs, I don't hate taking a flyer on Jordan Reed in case he happens to get into the end zone or just catch a couple of balls. Now, the matchup versus the Cardinals last year, it was always tight ends versus the Cardinals. This year, they've definitely fixed that. They're now allowing the 6th fewest points per game of the position, their 9th DVA versus the pass, but this is mainly just a price play. And if George Kittle happens to be out, he'd definitely be the best point per dollar option at the tight end position, despite the quarterback being CJ Beathard in this one. Then moving on to defense is never really fun to talk about, but we have the Dolphins, Bucks, Cardinals, and the Raiders here. So the Dolphins, I mean, they're 3-point favorites. They have a team total of 22.25 against them. It's not great, but they do have a pretty overall solid defense, and I'm not sure if Marcus Mariota is going to go absolutely off once again. Not saying he's a bad quarterback or anything, but I mean, he's a backup for a reason. I don't think he's the greatest, but he does have rushing upside, which I guess could hurt the Dolphins a little bit, but overall they do have a pretty strong defense. If they shut down Darren Waller, I don't think they should get blown. I don't think they're going to get blown up or anything. And the Buccaneers defense, definitely not the greatest recently, but they're facing Detroit. They're 9.5 point favorites, and they have a team total of 22 against them, so I think they're viable. I just feel like they're a bit expensive here. The Cardinals, $3,300. They're facing CJ Beathard, so I feel like this might be the chalky way to go. They have the lowest implied team total against them, and they're 5-point favorites at home, so I feel like most people are going to go with the Cardinals in cash games, and I can totally agree with that. Then the Raiders defense, this is mainly just if you need a punt defense. They're cheap. They're not the greatest defense in the world. They're bad versus the pass and versus the run. But to be honest, Tua does not scare me too much. I just feel like they could get destroyed in the ground with either Gaskin or Salvin Ahmed, but still a 25.25 applied team total against them, which is the highest we talked about yet. But they're only 3-point dogs here. They're playing at home. I don't think they're the worst play in the world point per dollar wise, but they're definitely not a great defense. You just kind of have to hope they get around like 3 to 5 points, and I don't think it's going to kill you unless one of these other defenses happens to get a defensive touchdown. So I think that's going to be it for the video, guys. So I hope it was helpful, and if it was, make sure you leave a like, and if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out. I really do appreciate it. You can follow me over on social media. The handle is in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. Like I said earlier, if you want to support the channel over on Patreon, always much appreciated. You get access to all the stuff that I offer on there. Also cover NBA as well. I just don't make videos for it on YouTube just to save me some time. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Hope you guys enjoy the rest of your week, and Christmas is coming soon, and hope you guys have a wonderful Christmas as well.